This is Part 5 of Unit 2, Prominence in the Utterance. These are the topics that we have covered so far. In our last section we covered the group of elements who stay between the semantic sense selection and the pragmatic sense selection. We also discussed whether the prominence choice takes place at the word level or the utterance level. We described the factors that affect this group of words or phrases, such as their idiomaticity, their ritualistic nature and their generic dependence. Finally, we explained Brazil's concept of orientation regarding prominence in its two formats, oblique and direct orientation. The choice of prominence syllables at utterance level is a pragmatic selection. According to Brazil, it results from the state of understanding between the speaker and hearer and is affected by an ongoing negotiation of meaning, that is the local adaptations that the interaction imposes on language choice. The most evident example of negotiation of meanings is the so-called language in action talk, in which speaker and hearer make spontaneous verbal and non-verbal decisions, and this process is filled with phenomena such as reformulations, restarts or false starts. What is being negotiated? The new and old pragmatic meanings of the linguistic elements, anchored in the particular context in which the interaction takes place. Another dimension of the pragmatic sense selection of prominence is the influence of cultural knowledge in the choice of linguistic items and their discourse prominence. In most speech communities, speakers have been socialized into the society's norms, values or cultural ways of speaking. This process took place first in the domestic domain, that is home, and then during formal instruction in education or job training. Therefore, pragmatically speaking, there will be very circumscribed conversational routines which will transpire specific cultural knowledge. We are talking about proverbs, sayings, routine-like expressions. These conversational routines also express cultural beliefs and attitudes. If we take a look at Maya's representation, we can see how the linguistic choices used by some interlocutors relate to their perception of context and their underlying cultural values and beliefs. In intercultural communication, for example, when a native speaker of English interacts with another non-native speaker of English, the non-native speaker may lack the background knowledge that the native speaker possesses and therefore, the process will bring about more divergent expectations. But this could also occur between speakers of different varieties of English, because there may exist culturally specific linguistic choices for the same speech acts and different prominence patterns and even differing intonational choices. Another related factor is group affiliation. Belonging to a group generally means using a certain group identification vocabulary. These ready-made phrases represent the identification of the group as such and locates them in a particular discourse community or ideological group. In this way, the CRs, either idiomatic or not, will index social membership, such as being part of an age group or cohort, sharing a regional identity, being united by a particular hobby, having the same jargon because of a joint profession, etc. For Hofstede, during interactions, individuals use language with a collectivistic tendency, or an individualistic tendency. For Maya, no individual would be completely individualistic or collectivistic. Rather, they will behave verbally and non-verbally, more individualistic in one domain and more collectivistic in another. From a conversation analytic perspective, groups display social roles and relationships. Sachs calls those social roles and relations, membership categorization device. These membership categorization devices, or MCDs, identify listeners as having specific occupations, ethnicity, family status, etc. And they can be present in an interaction either because they are explicitly stated, or because they can be inferred from what is said. Interestingly, a subcategory of the MCDs states that group membership is based on knowledge disparity, that is, the fact that in an interaction we may identify an expert and a layperson, regarding certain topics or activities. Clift mentions a related notion which is authority. How is this related to prominence selection? Speakers and hearers negotiate not only information but also social identities during an interaction. Therefore, they employ linguistic expressions, like vocatives for example, with a specific prominence pattern. The same applies to the CRs that are expected of an expert or dominant speaker and a layperson or non-dominant speaker. Last but not least, the interactant's negotiation of informational meaning and social meanings involves the speaker's positioning or perspective towards them. Speakers and hearers tinge or dye their factual information with their stance. Stance is present not only in written language, but in oral discourse and new multimodal discourses, as well. When we read, hear or watch a text, we cannot fail to identify the author of the assertions, evaluations, etc. And this is done in a systematic way, in which we are able to single out the authors of that ideological position, the relationship with their interlocutors, the evaluation made, and how different or similar it is to the previous stances by other interlocutors. Interestingly, in relation to prominence, the stance taker rarely shows herself or himself, so there is no person-related prominence. If stance verbs such as think and guess are used, the prominence will be allocated to the evaluation, that is, the statement, and not to the person or stance verb. However, if the stance verbs express disagreements or cognitive verbs are used, there will be a tendency to make them prominent, with the subordinate statement being prominent, too. A special case occurs when the stance taker wants to assume his or her responsibility for the evaluation or assessment. For this, the speaker will produce prominence in the pronouns or noun phrases which reference himself or herself. It is necessary to mention that all these factors are not independent of each other. That is, speakers do not choose to show group membership and not to use cultural knowledge in a particular linguistic expression or conversational routine. Sometimes several factors are present in a locution. When they are absent, this may mean that the speaker does this on purpose. Overall, by paying attention to the prominence patterns used systematically by interlocutors, we can identify blocks of interactions which reveal the factors associated with them.